Okay, so today we're going to be dealing with a funny underbelly of America, which is the slave business. And we were just talking offline. There were slaves in other parts of the world. The Russians had slaves. There were Scotch taken in battle by the English that were sold as slaves to the Turks. So slaves existed elsewhere as well. And of course, in the Caribbean and Brazil and so on. But today it's America. So with that in mind, I'm going to pull a screen up. Okay. So I'm going to start by introducing my partner in crime here, Ann Neal. For those who are in the room, Ann's in the front row here. And Ann is somewhat famous for having created this is a blog she has called Bittersweet, which is the issue of slave ownership and descendants of the slaves that were owned. And so she'll be talking about that a little bit as well. Okay. So just in case anybody here isn't into the topic, slaves did not have typically a very pleasant life. So let's put aside the imagery that slaves may have enjoyed their life. So first, the slaves came to Jamestown 1619. For those of you from New England, yes, Jamestown was founded before Plymouth. Okay, I know that's hard to recognize, but it's true. Initially, Indians were enslaved as well as blacks, but in 1682, Virginia passed a law that said you couldn't enslave Indians. 1720s, we began to see a switch. The slave trade, everybody I'm sure in college was trained on or in high school, the three-way trade with the slaves. The slave trade was dominated by New England and particularly Rhode Island. So you can go to Rhode Island, Providence, and see some great houses dating from the 1700s that were founded on the basis of the slave trade. 1777, Vermont passed the first legislation prohibiting slavery. 1787 in the Constitution, this was probably the most controversial issue, and they were not going to get a constitution without allowing slavery. And that was when the famous 3/5 number came in. A slave was 3/5 of a person in terms of representation. 1802, it had been suggested in the Constitution that we would stop the importation of slaves, so we did. 1820, everybody remembers the Missouri Compromise, which sort of got followed. And then the Emancipation Proclamation, which, if you don't remember, was only for those areas that had been part of the Confederacy and had been captured by and weren't captured yet. So, and then finally the 13th Amendment. So at the time of the Constitution, there were probably 750,000 slaves in this country. By the time you got to the Civil War, there were over 4 million. Okay, the very top line here, the blue line, is the total number of African American people in the United States. And this is in 1860, the census there was a slave census as well as a regular census. And so if you count the people in the slave census, there were about 4 million, and they were most populous in the Deep South and Virginia. Okay, and then a little bit in the Missouri, Arkansas states. So what happened? Well, you couldn't bring in slaves. And in areas like Virginia, the productivity of slaves was very limited. Slaves were at the greatest value with the cotton plantations and the rice plantations. So people in Virginia began the business, not began, but were in the business of raising slaves to sell them. Okay. So of that 4 million slaves, the better part of 1 million had been actually raised and sold. And when Virginia, over almost 500,000 slaves were sold from Virginia in this period. Okay. And typically, some of them would go by boat around to New Orleans, but a lot of them went by a trail of tears, on foot, from Virginia, through Tennessee, through Mississippi, down to New Orleans. And there was no rare attempts to keep families together. One of the myths is that the only slaveholders were the wealthy plantation owners. It is correct to say that the large plantations were the place where most slaves were held. But 30% of all the households.
Use my microphone. I don't want to use my microphone. I want to use his.
Hello, can you hear me? Somebody say yes.
Yes.
Okay, we're hoping. Okay. 30% of all households had at least one slave. It was not uncommon to have one slave to work the farm, to work in the household. Okay, many of them were passed on by wills. A wealthy slaveholder's daughter might get a girl who would be her, accompany her as her maid for her whole life. In addition to the people who actually owned slaves, there were a lot more who benefited. The two ways that you can see, one of them is where you had a patriarch of a house, of a family with 4 or 5 children who lived around him. The slaves would all be owned by him, but they'd be split up among his children's households. They would benefit fully from having them. And if you were a farmer nearby, unrelated, and you needed some help during harvest time, he'd lend you some slaves for some money. Okay. Not to mention the fact that there were people who worked on the plantations. I had a brother of an ancestor who was in fact the overseer for one of the largest plantations in Virginia in the 1700s. Okay, well, so slavery was throughout. Your church was probably built by slaves. Okay. So there are 3 research challenges that Ann and I will talk about today. The first one is, how do you get your research around the ownership of slaves by ancestors? Okay. So let's look at the censuses, which is where we often start. The 1790, 1800, and 1810 censuses just list the total number of slaves. They're doing a head count so they can get their representation in Congress. 1820, 30, 40, slaves are listed by age and sex. 1850 and 60, we have separate censuses. These are very important in tracing slave ancestry later on, which we'll talk about. But it's very easy for you, if you have an ancestor, to start with the 1860 census and basically say, slave census, and basically say, did this person actually own slaves? Oh, by the way, they would typically designate the slaves as black or mulatto. Okay. The way the law worked, your potential for being a slave was based on your mother's condition. So if your mother was black, it didn't matter if you had a white father you are now a slave. Were the reverse to happen, and there is actually a famous case in Virginia where it did, where a white woman had a child by a black man, and the courts told her husband that he was fully responsible for that child of his, her white husband, because that's the way. The other place you will find information prior to about families is wills and inventories, and those become quite powerful. So, Anne, is this where I can dig you in? Okay. Anne and I are sharing presentations, so bear me a second while I switch to hers, and hopefully we will get it right. Yes, question. Mic turned down? Oh, just a moment. Lights turned down. Thank you for reminding me. Okay, give me a minute while I get Anne's presentation up. There you go, Anne. The folks on Zoom can't hear you otherwise.
Is it on? You can hear me? Closer? There we go.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I should say something about myself a little bit. Unfortunately, I shake, so this is going to be hard for me to manage it. Okay, I will manage it though. This is, I think, one of my favorite photos out of old family photos, and I think couldn't illustrate white roots any better. The middle boy is my father, and the woman next to him is my grandmother, who's very important to this whole thing. The man on the right, on the left, I'm almost positive is her, my father's grandfather, John W. Neal, and my grandmother's father-in-law. The other people, I don't know who they are. I have a vague notion about the woman in the back. My grandmother might be a cousin, but I just don't know. There were no names on the photo, as there should be. It would be lovely if everybody would take all their family photos and name them and date and place and all that for us later people. In any case, do I move this, your machine? Okay, I got involved in genealogy when I was working on my dissertation. I have a doctorate in sociology from Berkeley, but I was teaching at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma at the time. And I took a leave off of a semester to finish writing it. And I would work and work and work on the dissertation, which was not on this topic, but in another topic in race relations. I'd been very, very involved and interested in race relations since I'd been in college at UCR, University of California, Riverside, when it just opened. I mean, I'm always happy to say that because I was one of the first, they call it the pioneer classes, you know. In any case, my grandmother, that grandmother had come to live with us. We moved from Missouri. I was born in Missouri. We moved from Missouri right after the war, which you all know what I mean by that. And most of you, you should. Um, we moved to California because my dad had been stationed out here. And once you see California, you don't go back. We came from Missouri. I grew up in Missouri. And we came when I was 8. And that grandmother very shortly moved out with us and lived with us for 10 years. And my mother had to deal with 5 children and his mother, who was not always easy at all. In any case, when she died, I inherited a shoebox that was under her bed. And some of you might have gotten into some of these things this way, but in it was this obituary. There were obituaries, there were lots of children here, there were, pictures, stuff in the shoebox that my grandmother had lugged around and kept under her bed. And they decided that I would be the one who would most care about it. And this is obituary, and it's not that you have to read it all, it's hard to see from where you are, but it's for Mrs. Courtney Jackson, who died 6 miles from Huntsville in 1889 from injuries received from a fall. She afterwards married Mr. Jackson, who died and left her with so many children, et cetera. She leaves a place that's vacant and we're all sad and everything. Okay. The only point about that obituary is there were 2 pieces about the shoebox. The obituary itself was something about these people in my past. I had been teaching a class on the social history of American women at my new position at the University of Puget Sound for about maybe 4 to 6 years before my first sabbatical. And that's part of what I was writing my dissertation, taking a semester off so I could finish. I don't know if you've ever written one. It takes a long time to finish them. In any case, I decided I was asking all my students to write about their grandmothers, to do a paper, a major research paper in the class about their grandmothers, where they lived, who their people were, who their parents were, because I got 2 more parents, et cetera. And I thought, well, that's not fair. I should do my own. And so I started doing genealogy based on that and this kind of a hint, because I didn't know who any of these people were. And I thought it was very intriguing also that I don't know if you've ever found one of these, but it said she was age 74 years, 9 months and 20 days. And people don't really count the exact days that you've lived anymore. I thought that was intriguing. And I thought, well, I'll go find out about these people. So I designed a project for my first sabbatical to go back to Randolph and back to Macon County, which is right above Randolph County, where she was from. My parents were both born in Macon County, and she was born in the other county. And I've got a whole lot of relatives were there. And I thought, well, I'll go find out what that's all about. Well, the first thing I did, oh, you're going to change for me? Okay, thank you. The first thing I did was look for letters and diaries. There were no letters and diaries. I think there's probably one diary that's from Howard County that actually refers to Randolph County and blah, blah, blah. And I learned the shocking fact that my great-grandmother, that one, Courtney Jackson, great-great-grandmother, didn't read or write. That was a shock to me. I mean, I didn't know any people in my family that didn't read or write. I mean, these are all the things one finds out when you really get into the family history, not just the names and the ages and births and deaths. In any case, I ended up looking at the census. And as George said, the 1930 census, this is the first census of Randolph County, Missouri. And this is not a copy of the census. This is a copy of some of my research that I was working on. I chose to to look at the whole county, because in sociology and in history at the time, which I'm on the edge of it, both of those fields, I'm sort of a historical sociologist or a sociological historian. I'm not sure which, but anyway, I decided, I'm sorry, at that time, it wasn't kosher at all to look at your own family. You couldn't get away with doing your own genealogy very well. It was uncool. You should write about other people. Now you can. Now a lot of people, enough people have done it, that people of some note, and so you can do that, and etc. But at the time, I thought, I want to study my families, but here's what I'll do. I'll look at the county and then I'll capture them. They'll all be, and this is just a summary of the 1830 census. These, it's actually organized by alphabetically, and the census, the actual, the regular census, that's the page line, etc. But this is how they're listed. White males, white females, black males, black females. That's when I found out that I was studying slavery, is when I went back to Missouri and I looked at the 1830 census and I thought, oh my God, all these families have all these black people in their families. What else is it? It's a slaveholding county. And not everyone owned. As you can see, most of the people, as George said, a lot of them had one or two, etc. There's occasionally 12 or 15, but in that period, I think the largest group I found clear up to 1860 was that owned 21. That's a maximum. That's my maximum I found in that county at that time. Well, when you look at the slavery in your families, if you're looking for it, you've got to know that the pieces of the census to use. That's one thing. You've also got to know that it may not show up. Let's say they did own one. It might die. The person, the human being that they own might die in that period. They have some kind of financial problem in the white family. They sell the enslaved person. There's all kinds of things that can happen so that you might miss it if you don't do it over time. That's really important. Okay, the other thing here is, notice it tells you they're males and females. It tells you their ages, 0 to 9, 10 to 23, 24 to 35, etc. But that's what you're looking at, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0. That's all you can find. Let's go to the next one. I did a lot of research on this over a period of about 10 years. And I got to the place where I had looked, what I don't have here that I'd love to show you, I do have it, the original, excuse me, I'm going to cross you here, is a copy of the 1850 census, just what it looks like, because it's really true that I had looked for a certain amount of time for my own genealogy. Why is that making that noise? Okay. It's not making it now, right? Okay. I looked in the 1850 census, I filled out my charts, my family sheets, all that sort of thing, and I didn't know that you have to look for a slave schedule. It's a separate item. It's like if you look at the 1830, that's fine. It tells you all the families, and you once for the white people like this, that's going to be very difficult for me. Okay. You have a holder? Yeah, can I borrow it? The holder? No, that one. I don't care. No. Well, that's all right. Never mind. I'll do it. I'll do it. Just ignore my thing. Closer to my mouth. Straight is good enough. The dance with the microphone. Yes. Okay, I think I can get this. All right. Wait a minute, I got to get back to where I was. On 1850, you suddenly get the lights turning on for white people. The lights turn on suddenly because I was looking for women. I was teaching a class on women in US history, social history of American women. So I went to Missouri thinking I was going to study pioneer women. And what I found out that the pioneers were really the Black people who were doing all the clearing, doing all the, they were all working together, but it wouldn't have been done the way it was without that they used enslaved people. And I was particularly looking for the women, and in 1830, like in that other slide that we were looking at, it doesn't show the women, it shows head of household. And it isn't until he dies that you see her name because she becomes head of household. And I learned so much in doing this. I really hadn't known before. I learned to do this kind of research. In any case, in 1850, it tells you the women's names, the children's names, their exact ages. It's not like 9 to 10 or what, I mean, 20 to 29 or something like that. It'll tell you 26. Now you've got something. You can really track when they were born and all that sort of thing. So in any case, I kept going. And eventually I was able to find the families, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm going to jump right here and make a jump to my search. And I'm going to look at one particular great grandfather that I had. It might be great grandfather, 3. Okay. And this is his probate record. When I discovered probate records, after I'd been looking at slavery and I knew that they held, and I knew they might have had 5 in 1850 or something. I didn't know their name. I can't know their names. I can only know their sexes and their ages. This is the inventory, the state of Thomas Jackson, who was my great grandfather in 1856. And in the middle of it, can you see this? It says one Negro man, Lewis, aged about 25 years. Can you see that? It's kind of really shaky, but just trust me. It says one DO means ditto in these records. DO, I'm saving a lot of time just telling you that. One DO man, Lewis, one DO woman, Amanda, 35, one, etc. Boy, Frank, 14, Mary, 8, Francis, 7, Lucinda, 5, Georgianne, 5, Nathan, I think 4, Sam, Celia, and then Nathaniel 2. And there, I then set my question, what can you know from this? One thing, you're getting their names. You're getting their names way before the end of another 10 years before slavery is really over. And for people who have been enslaved, they are never named until 1870 census for a census record. So that's why they always say when you're doing this kind of genealogy, whether Black or white, especially for Black people, if you're looking for your own family, you've got something they call the 1870 wall. Yeah, the 1870 wall. Can you get past the 1870 wall is the big question in genealogy if you're Black looking for your family, because that's the best place to get it. It tells you a lot more, but I'm not going to stay on that question, or otherwise I won't get going. I could do this for hours. I mean, it's fascinating. And the other piece is once you look, you begin to see how big the slave institution was and how much it affected all the institutions of that particular community. As George said, people who did not own might also benefit from it. How? They would rent slaves. And I think that might be, you asked the mortgage question, they also would buy slaves on time They would rent slaves. They would also, let's say they own the general market. The money that comes in from the local farmers is based on slavery. And that's a huge point. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is one of my other favorite all-time slides. You can't really see it, but it's the inventory that lists one rat trap, 25 cents, one Negro Manly, $1,000, one Ditto Lewis, 1,000, one Ditto Boy Frank, 500, one Ditto Amanda, 500. I wrote a paper about Amanda, and all you could learn from Amanda, I mean, from the official records about her life. And I did that partly because I think she was 10 years older or younger when I wrote that paper. I can't remember. But in any case, she was a woman. And I decided myself that those other people listed were probably her children. I can't know that for sure, but I confirmed it by following the next years and the next years and found them in the census. Either she was living with them or they grew up or whatever. In some way, I confirmed that they were. And I also confirmed that the wealth, when he died, I just read this last night, his movable property was listed at 1,100 and something or other dollars. His enslaved property was listed at $5,885. And it was a whopping, I figured that out, and I believe it was, I've got it here, the paper, but anyway, it's either, I think it's 83% of the total. It might be 63%. It doesn't matter. But Amanda was producing the wealth for that family. And she is not listed. She's listed at 500. The two young males are listed at 1,000 under the assumption that their strong bodies were more important to the wealth of the family than her. It was just a part of the misogyny of the time. Yeah. Were you going to say that? Okay. Yeah, they should be muted. Right. That's good. Thank you. What's the next slide? Yeah, you could. Oh, good. Perfect.
Back on now. Let me go to my Zoom thing. And I'm not going to stop share. Okay, I'm just going to go. Here we go. Participants. Mute all.
Yes, please. Except it's still frozen.
George, we can't hear you. George,
Okay,
we can't hear you.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay, I
now we
finally
can hear
figured,
you.
I figured out how to do it. I apologize. Okay, so I'm going to go back quickly one slide just to make a point. This is the 1860 census where Greengore is showing the ownership of slaves he has. And now we're going to go to the 1870 census. And here we have living literally next door to the other members of the Gore family, these families. And it turns out Margaret, Lucretia, and Sarah are in fact supposedly the mothers of his mulatto children. You can see some of the children are listed as mulatto, others as black. If they were trying to be accurate, that would have reflected which ones were, in fact, had a white father. Okay. So we're going to move now to the second of the three research challenges that happen with enslaved peoples. This is what happens if you've got someone who is a descendant of an enslaved person and you're trying to track their ancestry. As Dan was saying, you can use somewhat traditional techniques until you get back to 1870. But then prior to 1870, all you got is sex and number and sex and age and ownership. But this one does, 1870 does have names and ages. You can work with them. However, it turns out for African Americans prior to about 1935, there are a lot of records that are really not available that are available for whites. In Alabama, they did not record black marriages until 1935. And of course, you're dealing in the deep South, actually the South, you're dealing with mixed marriages were illegal, okay, up until well after this. So no slaves had birth, marriage, death records, are very rare. And marriages were not allowed between slaves. So, there's a famous imagery from that time of the jumping the broom ceremony, okay, which is a sad little piece of American background. Okay, so what you tend to do is use the 1870 and 80 census records to make sure you have a location that makes sense. which by the way, doesn't necessarily help a lot if these were people who were sold through New Orleans. And then you begin to look at the whites who live nearby and say, okay, can I identify landholders? And then can I potentially track back that extra generation by looking at so-and-so owned 20 slaves in 1860, and they were about the right ages to be 10 years younger than my family, which is in 1870. This is where you look at the wills, the inventories, as Em was mentioning. Then there's some other records that are interesting and say beneficial. Number of slaves went over to the Union side and fought for the Union, and there are pretty decent records of them. Okay, where they were from, what their ages were. There's what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, which is after the war. There was a bureau set up to help the freed slaves financially have a place to put their money. Histories and Bibles. And I found a particularly useful one in Georgia, where I have family that I'm tracking, which they had a list in 1875 and 1885 of the sharecroppers. And you sort of say, oh, okay, 1860, you're a slave on Mr. Smith's property. 1875, you're a sharecropper on Mr. Smith's property. Who owned you in 1860? All right, and in fact, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, I'm going to track this one, then we'll go over to Ann again. One of my nieces married a wonderful African-American, and Deonto, or nicknamed Chop McCormick. And as best I can tell, at least 7 of his great-grandparents were from slave ancestry. He's from deep Georgia. So I'm gonna take one of them, Bessie. Bessie would be his grandmother. Her father would have been Pomp. That's short for Pompey, which was a fairly common slave name. His mother was Nora Shepherd. We're going to track her. Her mother was Mary Shepherd, and her father was London Shepherd, which isn't always spelled that way, but anyway, it is London. So this is the 1880 census. And here we have, it's not spelled out as London, but London Shepherd, Jane, his wife, and their family, and all Blacks. And they're in Quitman, Brooks County, Georgia. Now, when we go back to the 1870 census, we have a more full family still in Quitman, our part of Brooks County. And nearby, we have William Jones, who's a farmer. And William Jones has $8,000 in property value, $2,270 in financial value. Ooh, you suppose he could be of interest? And the answer is, of course, yes. Because here is the slave schedule for William Jones in 1860. And I won't bore you with it, but it turns out that the dates, the ages of the kids here match. The slaves match. And then here is the property tax digest. Mr. William Jones is the employer, and his freedmen include, fourth one down, London Shepherd. So we now have tracked the Shepherds back to their owner, okay? Which, if you want to talk about any of the Black Lives Matter kind of issues, is a hellishly difficult task in most cases. Okay. Ann, would you like to take a shot at this? Okay, I'm going to get yours up. All right, stop sharing. You wanted to start with number 9. Yeah, I will do that. Oh,
This is interesting because as you can tell, we haven't rehearsed. Uh, and we're trying to blend our work here. Okay, a marriage record. And I think you put on your PowerPoint thing there that there were no marriage records in Alabama, did you say?
in most of the South.
Well, my finding was after 1865 and or 1866, after the Emancipation Proclamation, almost all the slaveholding states passed laws that anybody who wanted to live together now had to get married. What an interesting concept. You can live together all you want during slavery and you can't get married because that leaves the power of the slaveholder to get rid of your children, to decide what you do, to do the kinds of things that enslavement is about, which is have charge of that person's whole life. But now if you wanted to live together, you can't live together in sin, you have to get married. But the great thing for the genealogical researcher is it also requested not only that you get married, but that you list any children you name you name the children you list that you see as your common children. So this all goes back to Pam Smith, and Pam and I found each other in 1990s. I had been working in Missouri for about 10 years. I had been doing all that stuff and going back in the summers or whenever I had a chance or on sabbaticals to do more work. And Pam had started the whole project of trying to find her ancestors. And we ended, okay, what's next?
You want to go 25, right?
Oh, wait, I want to show you. Legally married, oh, yes. Legally married Baltimore Robinson and Emily Morris. They have 5 children named White, age 6, Charlotte, 5 years, Rand, 3 years, Melia, 2, and George, 1. Okay, who is Baltimore Robinson? Well, Pam and she's 20 years younger than me. And about the time when Roots came out, and then Queen, the television programs, that did more for genealogy than anything, especially black-white genealogy. She asked her grandmother, she wasn't that old, she was probably a teenager or a little older. She asked her grandma, where did we come from? They lived in Chicago. She was in Chicago. She said, well, I was born in Missouri and your grandfather was enslaved and his name was Baltimore Robinson. And Pam hadn't known that at all. They were from Missouri. She's from Chicago, born there, the complete Chicago trip. The Great Migration. They were definitely a part of the Great Migration. In fact, they came early. In any case, Pam started doing this work and going to National Archives, going to the Newberry Library in Chicago and all these places. Excuse me, I forgot. And she found out that enough about the family, and she called Randolph County Courthouse in Huntsville. It was the major place in Randolph County, in case any of you wanted to research there, to find the really old records. That's a joke, you know. Anyway, she called Huntsville and they said, well, we have a marriage record here. Would you like me to look? And they looked in the marriage record and found this. So there is a marriage record in many, many counties. There's a woman, Black genealogist named Barnetta McGee White, I believe, Barnetta McGee White, who has copied the entire marriage record for all the counties in North Carolina, Black marriage records. The one for Randolph County, it's called Marriages of Colored Citizens from 1866 to 1877, which is when supposedly Reconstruction was over, and et cetera. But it's a great source because this is done in 65 and it's before the 1870 census. And again, you're getting names. And also, if you have names, people often say that previously enslaved people did not always take the names of their owners, but they often did. So you don't know. They might or they might not. And within any one family, some of the children might take that owner, some of the children might take a later owner. I have a case where one man in Randolph County you find him first in the census with his most recent owner, and then the next thing he goes back to an earlier owner. So you just have to know these kind of these tricky things. Okay, go on.
Okay, just tell me where to stop, okay?
Okay. No,
No,
not that.
I know.
Yeah, go all the way to, I think it's 17. These are all part of our presentation, Pam and mine. Okay, you can stop. Pam goes back to Missouri and she goes back to Huntsville after this. I mean, first she told me, I want to go back and see where the ancestors lived. You think I ought to go? And I said, sure, you ought to go. But this is something that she wrote a poem about. What are we doing?
Nothing. I just messed up.